I think you are just as tired as I am after the second day, but okay, let's jump into that. So my name is Gáspár NAGY, and sometimes I identify myself as a half developer, half tester. Sometimes I identify myself as a BDD trainer and coach. And sometimes I say that I'm a kind of a BDD addict, as a kind of funny title. But this BDD addiction, or something dealing with such a topic deeply, is really helping me to think about some detailed topics that might look simple, but actually it causes some troubles. And actually, this year I wanted to bring such a topic, that how do we manage details in BDD scenarios. Of course, this talk will be somewhat special to BDD, but I think some of the findings could be also applied to any kind of testing or any kind of test descriptions. And this topic of lot of details, or details in the BDD scenario, sounds like a small little detail problem, but actually it causes quite some problems, and that's why I thought that, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into that. That's the agenda that I will go through and jump into the middle. Let me just give a very, very short summary of BDD. Fortunately, the colleague here morning was helping me to introduce a spec by example. So basically, BDD is essentially the same. So I just have 3 slides, basically. So if you have heard about BDD, then probably you have seen BDD scenarios. That's not the essence of BDD, but this is how you typically recognize that. And I like to see the BDD scenarios as some sort of bridge, if that helps. Actually, I stole the idea from Gojko Edge, was also mentioned by Martijn. And it's a bridge between the requirements and the application that we do. And of course, why do we need a bridge? That's an interesting question. Probably many interesting questions that you could ask. But the one that I have collected is that from the requirement side, maybe we would like to have the requirements better testable. So try to connect our test to the requirements. And on the app side, maybe we want to make our test better understandable. So it's just not looking like a big script, but we better understand what we really want to do with that particular test. So that could be some ways how to see that. I also were just bringing up some definition of BDD. There are plenty of definitions. That's not the only one, but that's a good summary, in my opinion. So BDD is about understanding, documenting, and verifying business requirements through illustrative scenarios or illustrative examples. So that's somehow how we should see that. And it says understanding, documenting, and validating, and that's a very important thing that we do these 3 things with that. I will not go too much into that, but actually, that can also help us to clear up some misunderstanding. As I said, when you typically hear about BDD, the first thing that comes to your mind is a BDD scenario with a given when-then, which essentially, especially if you are coming from testing, it really looks like a test. And it is, in fact. So typically, BDD scenarios are automated and serve as automated tests. But it's not only that, and that's a very important thing, and that's very important to understand that. So it's not only an automated test, even though that's an important aspect, but it's also illustrating the requirement, helping us to have a better understanding of the requirements, and also documenting our finding or the decisions that we have made, that what we actually wanted to do. So there are these 3 purposes. And testing is just one aspect of that. If you would only focus on that single aspect, probably something different would come out. So that's why it probably makes sense to highlight, especially if you will see my next topic, that BDD is not testing. It's not only testing, but it has an important relation to testing. And why I want to highlight that, because my next topic is that how can we see scenarios as tests? Because as I said, it's part of the story, and it's very important. And if you think about a scenario, especially as a test, then it's an automated test. That means that this automated test need to exercise the application. So go through the application, and in one of the interfaces, it just really need to go several actions, one after the other. And of course, if you want to do those actions, then you need a certain details to be able to perform all the actions. So for example, if you want to make a registration, then you have to fill out in some way all the details that are required to be able to complete a registration. And whenever we talk about details and details in scenarios, it's a very good starting point to understand that the details are there, the details are needed, otherwise we will not be able to submit the registration form if we are not filling out all the 10 different things that is required for that. So the question is not whether the details are there or not, but how do we express those details? So the details are needed during execution, so this is super important. For me, at least, as a BDD addict, this would bring up some interesting questions. Maybe you will also find them partly interesting. So we say that, okay, details, but what are those details? What kind of details do we talk about? What is a detail, and how we can better recognize that? And if those are details, and those are either visible or not visible, then how do we agree on that as a team, that when we are talking about what our testing process and testing strategy will be, and also how do we express, how do we document those details? Probably these are interesting questions. At least for me, I like to think about that. Storing and dealing with details in BDD scenarios is sometimes easy. There are some teams who are just naturally doing it well, and that's all good. Sometimes teams are struggling with that. Doesn't matter which category you are in. It makes sense to dig a little bit deeper so that we better understand what we need to deal with. So let's start with the last thing, so that how do we document those details, or how do we describe or express, or how those details come from? And again, a little bit oversimplifying the things, but you can imagine that roughly the details could be defined in 3 different areas or 3 different places. Of course, it could be part of the scenario. I can write it down into the scenario that for registration, this is the username, this is the password, this is the address, this is the whatever I want to use. Or you can just somehow get it from the code, either write it down into the automation code what the username should be, or just use a random generator, or whatever magic you do in the code, but the code can somewhat produce these details. Or maybe you get it from some external sources like a baseline database or Excel sheet or whatever else. And then, again, you use some sort of automation code piece that is reading those details up and just providing it for the test execution. So from that perspective, and this is what I wanted to highlight with the coloring as well, that it's either in the scenario or somehow managed by the code, either producing it itself or getting it from somewhere else. So that's basically the 2 categories. And typically, when we talk about this topic, then people used to say that, well, this scenario is too detailed. We should remove some details from the scenarios. But obviously, this is not a proper saying, because you are not removing those details. Those details are needed at the end for the execution. So you are not removing. What I really like as a term is that we are pushing it down to the automation. I don't know whether this down is really working anyway. So pushing it down to the automation. We are not removing or deleting, or these details will not disappear. These will be existing, but not in the way how they used to be. So pushing down is an important way to see that. Okay, so let's make a brief comparison. What are the benefits and disadvantages of storing those details in the scenario directly or in the code? Okay, so maybe you can make up your own mind. So why is it good to see it in the scenario? Why is it good to rather manage by the code? Here is my quick pro-con analysis. So the benefits of storing these details in the scenario, first of all, the visibility. So if the detail, if the username or the password is in the scenario, then whenever you look at the scenario, you immediately see what details have been used. So that's definitely a great benefit. And the other very important benefit, that if that scenario, the test starts to fail, then it's easier to start the analysis, because if you have seen that, okay, if it was using this as username and that as password, then you can try it out manually or whatever. It just starts the investigation somehow easier. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages as well. Typically, it makes the scenario hard to read. If you are working in a complex system, which I suppose you do, and if you really include too many details into the scenarios, then they will be big and hard to read. And this is also causing some maintainability problem, because those details might change accidentally, independently of the topic of the current scenario. I will come back to that a little bit later. So this is the scenario side. Let's see the code side, so that when the details are somewhat managed by the code. Again, there are some positive parts, so that primarily probably if you are managing it by the code, it's easier to reuse. So obviously, if you need to have a random password to be able to do a registration, you will need it in many other tests as well, so that it will be easier to reuse that particular thing. And plus, in the code, you can even define several layers, so that you can have some overall defaults, and then you can maybe have some specialization on that, and make some variations on that. So that's all possible. Somewhat the maintainability is easier. Code is generally suffering from the maintainability problem, so there are a lot of tooling and practices and whatsoever out there for maintainability. And you can still use those data that was somehow magically produced by the code to be able to make it visible during the execution. What you need to, what I mean on that is that maybe you're just logging out into the execution log, so it's so you still see what was the username and password for that particular execution. Of course, there are also downsides for that one as well. It's harder to see those things. So it's harder to explain it to the product owner that what kind of details were used for the execution. It's maybe might be harder to find in the code where these magic numbers or magic strings are produced or how it's working. So that's definitely a problem that we would need to address. And the code is not a shared asset, so in a sense that it's maybe owned by those who are able to maintain that code, who are having some programming skills. But for example, it's harder to share with an analyst or product owner or whatsoever. So there are pros and cons on both sides. So there is definitely not a clear answer for that. But I think in high level we can say that overall it is easier to manage the details in the code. On the other hand, we lose something on the visibility, so we need to work a little bit more on the visibility. And typically, the things like I mentioned, that writing out to an extensive log that is expressing what was actually happening is typically a good compromise. Okay, so that's how we can see these scenarios from the testing point of view. But let's see now from the other aspects. I said it's a bridge, so we have seen it maybe from the technical side. Let's see it from the other side. So what kind of things we can consider if we see the scenarios as part of the specification? And for that, what I really like to think about is that what makes a good specification? So what are those criteria? What are those conditions that are useful for a specification? And of course, you can find many different categorization, many different ideas, but maybe some of these things would come to your mind. So that definitely it has to be easier to read, to discuss, to review, because we want to make a shared discussion on that. So this means that it shouldn't be very big, it shouldn't have too much noise in it, or it should use a language that also the business is able to understand. So definitely not so much a technical language. Generally, we would like to have the requirements to work in a way that it should only change when the requirements are really changing. So if anything else is changing, the technology is changing, there is a new browser version, new Android version, whatever, still what we wanted stays the same. So we expect that the specification is also staying the same. So we would need to somehow reduce the amount of technical details, and we should really focus on what we want to do there. And maybe the third one would be that somehow we would like to get feedback for that particular scenario from anyone in the team, including the business. That means that the business would be able to decide whether this is a good test or a bad test, or is it really testing what I wanted, or is not testing what I wanted. And for that, being concrete is a big benefit. So if you just say a very abstract sentence that, well, if you register, then everything should be fine, then it's very hard to say that, is this really what we wanted? Because what does it mean that it's fine? So it has to be somewhat more concrete, and that actually helps. So these are some ideas that one can have if you think about specification, values in specification. And when we were working with Savros on our formulation book, which is in this BDD book series, we were trying to look into this criteria and trying to find some better wording to that so it's easier to remember. That's how we got these brief principles. Essentially, if you check it's exactly the same what I had in the previous slide. I don't want to go through that, but one line that I want to highlight is this essential. So this is we called this principle the essential principle, which is basically saying that we should omit any information which is not directly illustrating the behavior. So we should only keep the essential details, and we should somehow hide or push down the incidental details. But again, that sounds good, but still brings up the question that, okay, how do I decide whether something is essential or not? And unfortunately, it's not easy. So there is no easy answer to that, okay, if you see a password, whether it's essential or not, it's quite much dependent on the context. But some guidelines for that is that we think that something is essential if it's directly changing the outcome in BDD, the then step. So if that detail would be different, then the outcome would be different. That's a good sign that that is something is essential. And the other thing is that if it's somehow related to the topic, the purpose of the test. So if I want to say anything about the password, maybe the password strengths, then obviously the concrete password that I see is probably as an essential detail, while maybe the username is not. So that's maybe the two good hints that you can start, which actually means, and that's why it causes a problem, that unfortunately, if you just have a scenario and somehow you forget or didn't really think about what is the real outcome of the scenario or what was the purpose of that test, then it will be very hard to clean that up and very hard to eliminate those essential details or the incidental details. So unfortunately, you need to fix this first. So typically, if I get into a coaching and with the team, I try to analyze a scenario. The first thing that we need to do is that identify what we really wanted with this test and what is the purpose, what is the real outcome of that, and then we can have a better chance to find that. Last, I want to just share a couple of ideas about the kind of details that you might have. I just identified, I don't know, 8 different kinds. Maybe there are more. This is not really an exact list. And obviously, I will not be able to go through in 3 minutes through all 3. I will just show you 4, just to a little bit illustrate what kind of details are these and what does it mean, this push-down thinking. So the first kind of detail, maybe that's the most obvious, is when you are talking about the concrete properties of the entities that you are working on. So here you see an example where we need an order. And for the order, there are a lot of mandatory fields. So to be able to create an order, you need to have a lot of things. You need to have a status. You need to have a payment method whatsoever, because without that, you will not be able to create an order. So you need those details, but you don't necessarily need them in this particular test. They are not necessarily important in this test. So what you would need to do if you would like to eliminate these incidental details is somehow applying some sort of default so that we make a team agreement that if we don't say anything about the order, then it should have the status whatever created, and it should have the issue date today, or I don't know. So we have to make an agreement on that and apply to those defaults. Of course, it can happen that you are overriding those defaults. So in a particular test, the status is important, but that's all good. You can just highlight only those things that are important here. The other is the entity existence, so that sometimes we need to create some new entities just because it's required by our model. So in my stupid example, I just say that for my customer, I need to have at least one address record. Which is in some tests maybe that's interesting, but if it's not interesting, then we would need to apply again some sort of defaulting things, so that whenever I just say that I create an order, it automatically creates all the necessary attachments to that. Or you can see this in another way around. To be able to create an order, you must have a customer as well. But if this is not interesting for you, then you can just basically again apply some defaults that whenever I just say that please give me an order, then it automatically ensures that there is a customer there. Technical details, probably that's the one that you have seen many times. And if you look at my example, then probably you immediately spot out that that's a technical detail, right? So I think we can all agree to that. But what I want to highlight, this is not the only technical detail. The other technical detail is that we were clicking a button. Okay, so that's because that's somehow related to the technology, the techniques that you have used for automation. And unfortunately, to be able to fix this, it's a hard work because you need to go to the why question. That why we clicked to the button, what was the business purpose on that, and somehow we need to identify this business needs and refine the scenario based on that. Maybe in this case, we wanted to click that particular button because we wanted to start changing an order. And the last one is basically the workflow steps. With that, I wanted to highlight that the details are not necessarily data. Sometimes the details are different steps that you would need to go through to be able to get to a point. And in that case, pushing down those details into the coding is somehow eliminating those details and rather focusing on what we want and maintain that from the code. So actually, I'm done. Basically, what we have seen is that these scenario details are needed for the execution, but you don't necessarily want to express them in the scenarios. We have also seen that to be able to use the scenarios as specification, you have to have them focused and clean, and there are probably different detail types, and you need to somewhat identify those and try to apply these push-down strategies that we have seen. So that's my final message. So try to watch for these details, try to find some techniques to push them down, and of course, make sure that you do this as a team, because all those details still have to be agreed with the entire team. So that was my session for today, and thank you very much, and happy to have the questions.
Thank you. I don't think it started from 5. Can I please ask our colleagues to put back the questions for 4 minutes? 4 percre vissza tudjátok a kérdéseket? Köszi. Okay. Are you ready?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Can BDD replace requirements?
So the answer is obviously no. So BDD is a way to have a better understanding of the requirements. I think Martin was also mentioning that the scenarios are not, or someone mentioned definitely, that the scenarios are not the requirements. They are just illustration for the requirements. They are just helping you to have a better understanding of those requirements. And those business rules and those rule levels are the real requirements. So it's absolutely not a replacement. It's just an improvement of having a better grip or better understanding on the requirements.
Do you recommend to combine BDD with TDD, ATDD techniques, or BDD is good enough alone?
Oh, okay, so that's a very good question. So I know that it's bad to say that because I'm a kind of a BDD expert, but actually BDD, ATDD, and spec by example is exactly the same. So it's just different names for the same concept. So there is no difference really, at least on the concept level on those.
In our organization, we write AC in Gherkin or Gherkin. Is that a good practice, or is it even a practice?
Definitely it is. So I think generally I would say yes, but you have to be careful what you call an AC or acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria are those rules that would need to be fulfilled. Okay, while scenarios are the examples. So I know that many teams are using this acceptance criteria term differently, so they call the acceptance criteria actually the acceptance tests, but acceptance criteria, acceptance test is the same concept as rules and scenarios, so helping to have a better understanding of the acceptance criteria with the help of the scenarios is absolutely a good practice, yes.
In which phase would you involve the end user into the BDD process? Immediately from the beginning, or keep the approach for the tech persons or people?
Oh, very, very good question. Actually, this should have gone to Martin because it's more interesting for the example mapping thing, so that when you start to design these scenarios, so all these things, BDD, example mapping, all the spec by examples, are based on the concept of trying to have a better understanding of the problem through examples, okay? And this is not new. I mean, this is how humans learn, right? So that you are just trying to learn how whatever a dog looks like by seeing a lot of dogs, and then you recognize what is a dog. So this technique works in every level. So if you want to have a better understanding of your customer, go there to your customer and ask them to tell a concrete story, how they would like to have their system work, and ask them for a few examples, and you will have a much better understanding of the things. So this part of the technique absolutely works on that. When we say BDD, we typically, on that phase where the user stories have already been defined and we just want to discuss the details of the user stories, on that level, typically the customer is not needed. These are too low-level details, low-level specification details that would make sense to invite the customer. There would be nothing wrong with that, but I would do it in a two-phase thing. I would apply the same technique in a higher level with the customer, and I would just do it with the team during the story refinement.
All right, one more. BDD simulants use causes with a given level of abstraction? Question mark. You froze.
So yeah, no, I just wanted to think about that. So probably the thing is that what the person was wanted to ask, that if you are describing these scenarios in this high-level business level, that's a higher level abstraction than if it would be all coded down into whatever a test method or a test script, and that's true. But that's actually not a bad thing. So basically, every test has actually two aspects: that what you wanted to do and how you achieved that. And basically, with BDD, at least if you do it with this cucumber style, basically you better separate these two aspects of the testing. So I think that's a good thing, or it's not necessarily bad.
Thank you very much, Gáspár. One more big applause for our presenter. Köszönjük. Thank you so very much.